The night did not begin with fire. It began with confidence. Torches burned low along stone corridors where men believed history was already written in their favor. Guards laughed softly, officers drank, scribes slept. Beyond the walls, the world seemed quiet, obedient, settled. Nothing about the air warned that an empire had only hours left before it crossed an invisible line. No prophecy was spoken. No enemy banners were seen. And yet, in that single stretch of darkness, something irreversible was already moving. Empires rarely fall the way people imagine. There is no sudden collapse, no instant silence after a final scream. They die the way people do, first through denial, then through routine, and finally through a moment when it becomes impossible to pretend any longer. This night was not loud at first. It was ordinary. And that is what made it lethal. Every great system depends not on strength, but on belief, belief that tomorrow will look like yesterday, belief that rules still apply, belief that power is permanent. On this night, belief remained intact, even as reality quietly withdrew its support. Somewhere, a decision had already been made, not in panic, not in rage, but with calm assurance. A door was left unguarded. A warning was dismissed. A signal was misread. The kind of mistake that seems too small to matter, until it becomes the only thing that matters. The people inside the walls trusted their numbers, their reputation, their past victories. They trusted that fear still worked. They trusted that the world remembered who they were. What they did not realize was that memory had begun to fade. History often records the morning after. The smoke. The bodies. The shocked survivors trying to explain how something so vast could be undone so quickly. But the truth is always hidden in the night before, when nothing seems urgent enough to challenge habit. This was a night ruled by procedure. Orders followed protocol. Messages moved slowly. Commanders assumed tomorrow would bring another chance to fix what today ignored. Empires love tomorrow. Tomorrow is where accountability goes to sleep. Outside the center of power, people who had nothing left to lose were watching. They had counted the guards. They had learned the routines. They understood something the empire no longer did, that systems grow predictable when they stop fearing consequences. While the rulers measured strength in symbols and ceremony, others measured it in reaction time, morale, and silence. And silence, on this night, was everywhere. No one inside the palace thought this would be the moment. That is the most consistent lie power tells itself, that collapse must announce its arrival. That there will be warnings impossible to ignore. That history will knock loudly before entering. But history prefers whispers. It slips in through overconfidence, through exhaustion, through the unchallenged assumption that what has always worked will always work again. Somewhere, a man responsible for security chose sleep over inspection. Somewhere, another chose tradition over adaptation. Somewhere else, a message arrived too late to matter. Each choice was reasonable on its own. None of them felt like betrayal. None of them felt dramatic. That is how disasters succeed, by feeling harmless until they are unavoidable. By the time the first alarm would finally sound, the outcome was already sealed. Not because of superior force, but because the empire had trained itself to react slowly. Its size worked against it. Its hierarchy delayed truth. Its confidence filtered out uncomfortable information. On this night, the system performed exactly as designed. And that design no longer matched reality. The most dangerous moment for any empire is not when it is weak, but when it believes it has survived every test that matters. This night was proof of that illusion. The guards believed the walls were enough. The leaders believed the past was protection. The citizens believed someone else was watching. And belief, once separated from reality, becomes a liability. When dawn would come, historians would argue over causes. They would name enemies, weapons, strategies. They would debate tactics and outcomes. But all of that would miss the deeper truth, that the empire did not fall when the first blow landed. It fell when it stopped listening, stopped questioning, and stopped imagining that it could be wrong. Because the end of an empire is rarely a single strike. It is a single night when no one realizes they are already too late. To understand why that night mattered, the world around it must be reconstructed carefully, layer by layer, without rushing toward its end. The city at the center of this story had been many things before it became vulnerable. It had been a capital that outlived its founders, a fortress that resisted centuries of siege, a symbol that convinced enemies it was untouchable simply by existing. For over 1,000 years, this city shaped trade routes, crowned emperors, and defined what power looked like between East and West. By the 15th century, it was no longer the heart of a vast empire, but it still carried the weight of one. This was Constantinople, the last great remnant of the Byzantine Empire. Once stretching from Italy to the Near East, the empire had been reduced to little more than its capital and scattered territories. Yet maps did not tell the full story. Constantinople still controlled the Bosporus, the narrow artery between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Whoever held this city regulated commerce, movement, and influence across continents. Even diminished, it remained strategically indispensable. By 1453, the balance of power around the city had shifted decisively. A new force had been consolidating strength for decades, absorbing land, learning from defeats, and modernizing its military with ruthless efficiency. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a rising threat, it was an established power. Its ruler, Mehmed II, was young, ambitious, and acutely aware of symbolism. To him, Constantinople was not just a city. It was a statement waiting to be claimed. Inside the walls, reality looked very different. The population had collapsed from hundreds of thousands to perhaps 50,000. Entire districts stood half-empty, their churches echoing with absence. The empire's treasury was depleted. Appeals for help had been sent westward, to Rome, to Venice, to Genoa, but help arrived slowly, cautiously, and in fragments. Western powers argued theology while the threat organized artillery. Promises replaced preparation. Still, the city believed in its walls. The Theodosian walls were among the most formidable defensive structures ever built, 3 layers of stone, towers, moats, and elevation. For centuries, they had stopped armies that vastly outnumbered the defenders. The walls were not just architecture, they were psychological armor. As long as they stood, the city believed it could endure anything. The defenders numbered fewer than 8,000 soldiers, including foreign volunteers. They faced an Ottoman force estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 men. The imbalance was staggering. Yet the city had survived worse odds before. What had changed was not courage, but context. Warfare itself had evolved. Gunpowder had rewritten the rules, and the Ottomans understood this better than the Byzantines were prepared to admit. Outside the walls, massive cannons, some weighing several tons, were positioned with patience and intent. These were not symbolic weapons. They were designed to break assumptions. Each shot tested not only stone, but faith in the old order. Inside the city, repairs were made nightly. Cracks were filled. Morale was spoken of carefully, as if naming fear would invite it. The emperor, Constantine XI, knew the situation was dire. He walked the walls, spoke to soldiers, and participated directly in defense. But leadership could not compensate for numbers, technology, and time. Every day the siege continued, the defenders weakened. Every day, the Ottomans learned more about the city's rhythms. What made this moment historically dangerous was not merely the threat outside the gates, but the internal tension within the city itself. Religious divisions persisted. Some citizens believed compromise with the Ottomans was preferable to submission to Western religious authority. Others still trusted that divine intervention would repeat history's miracles. Hope fractured into incompatible beliefs, and unity, always the city's greatest strength, became fragile. Meanwhile, the Ottomans closed the noose methodically. Ships were dragged over land to bypass defensive chains in the harbor. Supply lines were cut. Psychological pressure mounted. Drums beat through the night. Silence followed. The siege was not constant chaos, it was calculated exhaustion. Every action was meant to normalize fear. As weeks passed, something subtle happened inside Constantinople. Emergency became routine. Danger lost its sharpness. People adapted to bombardment, to casualties, to loss. Adaptation felt like resilience, but it also dulled urgency. When everything is a crisis, nothing feels like the final one. By late May, the walls were damaged, but still standing. The defenders were exhausted but not broken. The Ottomans were confident but not reckless. And then, quietly, both sides reached a threshold. For the attackers, patience had paid off. For the defenders, faith in endurance began to mask the reality of depletion. This is where context matters most. The night to come was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of strategic pressure, technological change, political fragmentation, and human denial. Nothing that happened next came out of nowhere. And yet, when it arrived, it would still feel sudden. Because history rarely ends where people expect it to. It ends where preparation stops matching reality, and that moment was closer than anyone inside the city walls was willing to admit. As the siege stretched on, pressure no longer came in waves. It became constant, grinding, and intimate. Each day reduced the margin for error. Each night tested the defender's ability to remain human under conditions designed to erode exactly that. Sleep arrived in fragments. Food was rationed with increasing precision. Injuries that once would have meant rest now meant a return to the walls. Survival narrowed into a series of short decisions measured in hours rather than plans. The numerical imbalance was no longer abstract. Fewer than 8,000 defenders were responsible for miles of walls, dozens of towers, and multiple points of impact. At some sections, fewer than 50 men stood between the city and the largest army in the region. Against them stood tens of thousands, rotating shifts, fresh supplies, and a command structure built for sustained pressure. Every defender understood the arithmetic. They simply chose not to speak it aloud. Outside the walls, the besieging army adjusted with methodical discipline. Artillery fire was not constant by accident, it followed patterns designed to test responses. When repairs appeared overnight, cannons shifted focus. When defenders reinforced one section, another was targeted. This was not brute force. It was psychological mapping. The attackers were learning how the city thought. Inside, the rhythm of life shrank to the walls themselves. Bells no longer marked hours. Explosions did. Stone dust coated armor and skin, turning men the color of the fortifications they defended. Morale speeches were delivered carefully, avoiding words like end or last. Language itself became a defensive measure. Fear did not manifest as panic. It manifested as calculation. Men counted arrows. Engineers counted stones. Priests counted prayers. Everyone counted days. And as those days accumulated, something else accumulated with them, fatigue that no oath could override. The city had prepared for sieges measured in weeks. This one was stretching into something else entirely. The attackers understood timing. Assaults were launched not to succeed, but to test readiness. Small engagements forced defenders to man positions repeatedly, disrupting rest cycles. False alarms ensured that even silence became suspect. When nothing happened, tension increased. When something did happen, it arrived without warning. Predictability vanished. One of the most damaging pressures was invisible, sound. The deep percussion of cannons traveled through stone and bone alike. It could be heard long before impact, a low warning that allowed fear to bloom fully before destruction followed. Over time, that anticipation became worse than the damage itself. Men flinched before explosions. Sleep came with echoes. Supplies dwindled. Oil, arrows, repair materials, all were finite. The attackers could afford inefficiency. The defenders could not. Each decision now carried opportunity cost. Repair this breach or reinforce that tower. Feed these soldiers or save for tomorrow. There was no correct answer, only consequences. Command decisions grew heavier. Orders once given with confidence were now accompanied by silence afterward, as if everyone involved understood the stakes too well to speak. Authority remained intact, but it was stretched thin. Every officer knew that one mistake could cascade beyond correction. Meanwhile, the attackers maintained pressure without appearing desperate. Their camps remained orderly. Reinforcements arrived. Prayers were said openly. Confidence was displayed deliberately, not as arrogance, but as intimidation. They wanted the city to feel alone. And slowly, that feeling took hold. Perhaps the most corrosive element was hope itself. Hope that reinforcements might still come. Hope that weather might intervene. Hope that history would repeat its old patterns. Each hope delayed acceptance. Each delay postponed adaptation. Hope, when unsupported by evidence, became a strategic liability. The defenders had faced sieges before, but never one that combined old walls with new weapons so effectively. Cannons did not need to destroy the walls entirely. They only needed to make defenders question their permanence. Cracks became symbols. Every repair felt temporary. Every night of labor ended with the knowledge that tomorrow would undo it. Inside the city, civilians watched from a distance, contributing where they could, praying where they could not. Their presence was both motivation and burden. Soldiers were not just defending stone, they were defending families, history, meaning. That weight accumulated quietly. The attackers waited for exhaustion to do what force could not accomplish quickly. They observed reduced response times. They noted which sections repaired more slowly. They measured how long it took for reinforcements to arrive when alarms sounded. Warfare had become data-driven. By the final days, both sides sensed a narrowing window. The attackers prepared for a decisive move. The defenders prepared for another day. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. One side was transitioning toward conclusion. The other was still focused on continuation. Tension peaked not during assaults, but in the pauses between them. Silence stretched nerves thin. Every shadow looked intentional. Every sound felt amplified. This was not chaos. It was controlled suffocation. And somewhere within this pressure, a small imbalance began to form. Not in numbers, not in weapons, but in attention. A detail overlooked. A routine unchallenged. A moment when exhaustion quietly overruled vigilance. It was not dramatic. It was subtle. And it was exactly what the attackers had been waiting for. Because under enough pressure, even the strongest defenses do not break loudly. They slip. The turning point did not arrive with a thunderous order or a brilliant maneuver announced to history. It arrived quietly, buried beneath exhaustion and routine, concealed by the very confidence that had once protected the city. This was not the story of overwhelming force finally breaking resistance. It was the story of a small decision that no one believed could matter anymore. For weeks, the defenders had lived inside patterns. Patrols followed schedules refined under pressure. Gates were opened and closed according to habit, sometimes dozens of times a night, to allow messengers, scouts, and repair crews to move. These actions had become automatic. Under constant threat, repetition felt like control. It reduced chaos. It allowed the mind to survive. One of those access points was a minor postern gate in the northern section of the land walls, known as the Kirkaporta. It was small, unremarkable, and strategically insignificant, at least on paper. It was never meant for large troop movements. It existed for convenience, for communication, for the invisible logistics of a living city under siege. And because it was insignificant, it was trusted. Trust, under siege, is dangerous. On the night that mattered, the defenders were beyond tired. They had repaired breaches under fire. They had repelled assaults designed to fail. They had endured the psychological grind of noise, waiting, and loss. Commanders were stretched thin. Men were rotated not based on readiness, but on who could still stand. Under such conditions, vigilance narrows. It focuses on what has hurt you before. The main breaches drew attention. That is where the cannons had been pounding. That is where assaults had previously come. That is where commanders watched. The logic was sound. It was also incomplete. Sometime during the night, history cannot agree on the exact minute, the Kirkaporta was left unsecured. Not flung open. Not abandoned in panic. Simply not sealed properly after routine use. It was the kind of oversight that happens only when people believe the system around them is still intact. No alarm was raised because no one thought to check. No sentry sounded a warning because nothing looked unusual. Outside the walls, Ottoman scouts noticed movement where none should have been. They did not rush. They did not celebrate. They confirmed. When they were certain, they acted with precision. Small units entered quietly, meeting little resistance at first, not because there was none, but because no one expected an attack from that direction. This was not brilliance in the romantic sense. It was opportunism refined by patience. The Ottomans had spent weeks learning how the city breathed. They understood that exhaustion creates blind spots. They understood that defenders focus where pain has been greatest. They understood that no wall is impenetrable if attention is misallocated. As more troops entered through the unsecured gate, they did not immediately engage in mass combat. They spread. They climbed the inner walls. They raised their banners where defenders did not expect to see them. And in doing so, they triggered something far more devastating than physical damage. Confusion. From the inside, defenders suddenly saw enemy standards on their own walls. No one knew how many had entered. No one knew from where. Orders conflicted. Runners were sent. Signals were misread. In a system already strained, clarity vanished instantly. The defenders had trained for breaches from the outside, not emergence from within. This was the moment when structure collapsed faster than stone ever could. Units redeployed incorrectly. Sections of the wall were abandoned to respond to threats that were not fully understood. In trying to plug one hole, they created others. Momentum shifted not because of numbers, but because certainty evaporated. What made this mistake catastrophic was not the gate itself, but the assumptions behind it. The defenders assumed that minor access points could be managed by routine. They assumed that exhaustion could be compensated for by discipline. They assumed that the enemy would behave according to patterns already observed. Every assumption had been reasonable, until it wasn't. Meanwhile, the main Ottoman assault intensified. Now it had purpose. Pressure increased precisely where defenders were least able to respond. What had been testing attacks became decisive. Cannons fired. Infantry surged. And the psychological impact of enemies already inside the walls magnified every blow. Leadership tried to respond, but command relies on information, and information was fragmentary. By the time clarity began to return, it was too late to restore coherence. The system had crossed its threshold. This is the kind of moment history struggles to accept. There is discomfort in admitting that centuries of defense, sacrifice, and resilience could be undone by something so small. That is why accounts differ. That is why blame shifts. Some argue the gate was forced. Others insist it was opened deliberately. But beneath these debates lies a simpler truth: systems fail where they are no longer questioned. The defenders did not lose because they were weak. They lost because they trusted the shape of yesterday's war in a battlefield that had already changed. The gate was not the cause. It was the symptom. Empires rarely fall to their strongest enemy. They fall to the enemy that understands them best. By dawn, the consequences of that single unsecured moment would be impossible to reverse. But the full weight of it had not yet been felt. Not until resistance turned into retreat. Not until the city realized that the walls had not been breached everywhere, only where no one was looking. And that realization was about to spread. Once the imbalance revealed itself, events accelerated with a speed that no one inside the city could match. What had been a siege measured in weeks transformed, within hours, into a collapse measured in moments. The enemy was no longer an external force pressing against stone. It was inside the system, disrupting it from within, turning defense into reaction. Confusion spread faster than orders could contain it. Signals meant for one section reached another too late. Messengers ran into units already redeployed. Some commanders fought shadows, others waited for instructions that would never arrive. In warfare, hesitation is not neutral, it favors the side that has already committed to action. And on this morning, only one side had. As dawn approached, the main assault intensified with calculated brutality. Waves of attackers surged toward the most damaged sections of the walls, not to probe, but to overwhelm. Defenders who had held their ground for weeks now faced pressure without coordination. Their strength had been collective. Stripped of that, individual courage could not compensate. Street by street, the logic of defense collapsed. Urban warfare inside a besieged city is not heroic chaos. It is disorientation. Familiar streets become traps. Narrow passages amplify noise and panic. Civilians flee in unpredictable directions, complicating movement. Every corner demands a decision with incomplete information. And exhaustion turns judgment brittle. Some units fought fiercely, unaware that other sections had already fallen. Others withdrew prematurely, believing the situation was worse than it was. Both responses accelerated the same outcome. Momentum favors belief more than reality. Once enough people believe a position is lost, it becomes lost. The psychological shift was devastating. For centuries, the city had relied on the idea that its walls represented a boundary between order and chaos. When that boundary failed internally, the defenders lost more than ground. They lost the framework that made resistance meaningful. Without a clear perimeter, every stand felt temporary. Commanders attempted to regroup, but cohesion had been fractured. Defensive plans written for a linear battlefield could not adapt to a multidirectional threat. Fighting became localized, heroic, and strategically irrelevant. Individual acts of bravery no longer influenced the outcome. They only delayed it. The attackers understood this phase well. They pressed relentlessly, not giving the defenders time to reorganize. Their movements were not random. They targeted key intersections, elevated positions, and symbolic structures. Every banner raised inside the city carried psychological weight. It told defenders not just that the enemy was present, but that control had shifted. Civilians sought refuge in churches, homes, anywhere walls still existed. Bells rang not in coordination, but in alarm. Smoke rose from multiple districts, not all from fire, but from dust and debris churned by movement and destruction. The city's geography, once an asset, now amplified confusion. At the center of resistance, leadership continued to fight, but leadership without a system becomes martyrdom. Orders could no longer be enforced. Lines could not be re-established. Communication was reduced to shouting across chaos. The city was no longer a single organism. It had fragmented into isolated pockets of struggle. This was the true climax, not the breach of stone, but the collapse of shared awareness. Once defenders could no longer understand the full picture, they could not act strategically. They could only react emotionally. Fear, pride, loyalty, and despair competed for control of decisions made in seconds. As attackers poured deeper into the city, resistance hardened in some areas and dissolved in others. The contrast was jarring. In one street, defenders held until overwhelmed. In another, positions were abandoned without a fight. This inconsistency was not cowardice. It was the natural result of a system that had lost coherence. Time compressed. What felt like hours was often minutes. What felt like minutes had been unfolding all night. Memory blurred. Survivors would later struggle to sequence events because the experience itself resisted order. Collapse does that, it erases narrative. At a certain point, the outcome became irreversible. Not because defenders stopped fighting, but because fighting no longer served a strategic purpose. Control of key points meant supply routes were gone. Reinforcement was impossible. Retreat led only to further fragmentation. The attackers recognized this threshold and pressed harder. They did not seek negotiation. They sought conclusion. History does not pause at moments like this. It accelerates. By mid-morning, resistance had become symbolic. Pockets of defense remained, but the city as a functioning entity had ceased to exist. What remained was a series of human decisions made under unbearable pressure, some to fight, some to flee, some to hide. The empire did not fall in a single blow. It fell in overlapping failures, cascading faster than anyone could stop them. The gate had been the spark, but the fuel had been accumulating for years, underestimation, exhaustion, and faith in permanence. When the noise finally began to fade, it did not do so cleanly. It lingered in echoes, in smoke, in the silence left behind by something that had once believed itself eternal. The city still stood physically. Its walls still rose. But the system that gave them meaning was gone. This was the moment history remembers as an ending. But for those inside it, it did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like confusion finally catching up with reality. And only after the dust settled would the true consequences begin to emerge. When the fighting ended, the silence that followed was not peace. It was recalibration. Systems that had governed life for centuries were suddenly absent, replaced by new rules enforced not through negotiation, but through presence. The city did not vanish. Its people did not disappear overnight. But the framework that had defined authority, identity, and continuity was gone. What remained was transition, uneven, unsettling, and irreversible. For the conquerors, consolidation began immediately. Control was not assumed, it was asserted. Strategic points were secured. Surviving administrators were identified. Order was imposed with a clarity that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had preceded it. This was not destruction for its own sake. It was absorption. The city was too valuable to waste. One of the most symbolically significant acts came swiftly. The great cathedral at the heart of the city, Hagia Sophia, was repurposed. This was not merely a religious transformation. It was a statement about continuity and replacement. The structure remained. The meaning changed. In one gesture, centuries of imperial theology were folded into a new narrative of authority. For the population, survival required adaptation. Some fled westward, carrying with them texts, skills, and memories. Others stayed, navigating new hierarchies and expectations. Life resumed not because wounds had healed, but because it had to. Markets reopened. Streets were cleared. The machinery of daily existence restarted under new supervision. The disappearance of the old empire did not register everywhere at once. In distant courts, news arrived slowly, filtered through disbelief and denial. Many had assumed the city was eternal precisely because it had survived so long. Its fall forced a reconsideration of assumptions that had gone unchallenged for generations. Trade routes shifted almost immediately. Control of the passage between seas meant leverage over commerce, diplomacy, and movement. Western powers, suddenly aware of their vulnerability, began searching for alternatives. This pressure did not create exploration overnight, but it intensified a process already underway. When access narrows, innovation accelerates. Intellectually, the consequences were profound. Scholars who left the city brought with them classical knowledge preserved through centuries of copying and commentary. In new environments, those texts found different audiences. Ideas that had once circulated within imperial institutions now spread into universities, workshops, and private collections. Knowledge, displaced by conquest, became mobile. Politically, the fall marked a psychological boundary. The concept of an unbroken Roman legacy, already fragile, finally dissolved. Titles lost their weight. Claims to universal authority sounded increasingly hollow. Power was no longer justified by inheritance alone, but by capacity to defend and adapt. For the new rulers, the city became a capital not of memory, but of ambition. Its location enabled expansion in multiple directions. Its population provided labor and expertise. Its symbolism attracted legitimacy. What had once been the endpoint of an empire became the engine of another. Yet success carried its own risks. The same assumptions that had doomed the previous regime now threatened to take root in the new one. Systems grow confident. Borders stabilize. Procedures harden into tradition. The lesson of the city's fall was visible in stone, but lessons are rarely learned permanently. They are remembered until convenience erodes them. Across Europe, reactions varied. Some framed the loss as divine punishment. Others saw it as a strategic failure. Still others used it as justification, for reform, for expansion, for consolidation of power at home. The event became a mirror, reflecting whatever anxiety or ambition already existed. What is often overlooked is how gradual the aftermath truly was. There was no single day when the world collectively acknowledged that an era had ended. Instead, the implications unfolded across decades. New alliances formed. Military doctrines adapted to gunpowder realities. Fortifications were redesigned. Old methods were questioned, not because of theory, but because of evidence. The city itself transformed visibly. New buildings rose alongside old ones. Languages overlapped. Customs blended uneasily. This was not cultural erasure, but reconfiguration. Empires do not simply replace what came before. They repurpose it. In hindsight, it is tempting to frame the fall as inevitable. To point to numbers, technology, and geopolitics as proof that no other outcome was possible. But inevitability is a comfort historians grant themselves after the fact. For those living through the aftermath, nothing felt settled. Every decision carried uncertainty. Every adaptation was provisional. What the night of collapse ultimately revealed was not the weakness of walls, but the fragility of systems that mistake endurance for invulnerability. The aftermath exposed how much of the old order had been sustained by belief rather than capacity. Once belief was broken, reconstruction followed new lines. The world after the fall was not darker or brighter by default. It was different. Power concentrated where adaptability existed. Authority flowed toward those who understood that permanence is not a feature of history, but an illusion maintained through constant effort. Empires do not die only when they are defeated. They die when their assumptions outlive their usefulness. The aftermath of that single night made this truth visible to anyone willing to look, not as a warning shouted across centuries, but as a pattern quietly repeating. And in that pattern lies the final lesson, still waiting to be recognized. The most dangerous moment in any long-lived system is not its beginning, nor its decline, but the period in between, when survival is mistaken for proof of wisdom. By the time this empire reached its final night, it had already outlived most of its challengers, its critics, and even many of its original purposes. What remained was not just power, but habit. And habit is far more difficult to challenge than weakness. The fall did not happen because no one cared. It happened because too many people believed the structure itself would compensate for human limits. Walls would cover fatigue. Tradition would replace adaptation. Faith would substitute for coordination. These beliefs were not foolish. They were inherited. Passed down from generations that had seen them work. That is how systems endure, and how they blind themselves. History repeatedly shows that collapse begins when warning signs are interpreted as confirmation rather than contradiction. Each survived crisis reinforced the belief that survival itself was strategy. Over time, risk was redefined. Not adapting began to feel safer than changing. Questioning routines felt disruptive. And so the system optimized for stability in a world that was quietly shifting underneath it. What happened on that night was not an anomaly. It was alignment. Every small oversight, every delayed reform, every assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday converged into a moment when correction was no longer possible. The unsecured gate mattered not because it was small, but because it represented a culture that had stopped auditing itself honestly. This is the pattern that repeats across eras. Organizations fail the same way empires do. They listen less. They measure success by longevity rather than relevance. They confuse reputation with capability. And when pressure finally reveals the gap, they search for a single cause, an enemy, a traitor, a mistake, anything that avoids confronting the deeper truth. The deeper truth is uncomfortable. No system is destroyed from the outside until it has already weakened from within. External threats exploit internal inertia. They do not create it. The enemy outside the walls was patient, observant, and adaptive. But it was the defender's certainty that made patience effective. There is a quiet arrogance in assuming that past survival guarantees future security. It feels rational. It feels earned. And it is almost always wrong. History does not reward consistency. It rewards responsiveness. What endures is not what resists change, but what integrates it before crisis demands it. The empire's final failure was not technological or numerical. It was psychological. Leaders and citizens alike had learned to endure pressure without reevaluating its meaning. Endurance became the goal. Survival became the metric. But survival without reflection is only delay. In the aftermath, new powers rose, confident that they had learned the right lessons. For a time, they were correct. Then they, too, began to rely on routine. They built their own walls, physical, ideological, institutional. And slowly, invisibly, the same process began again. This is why the story of that single night matters beyond its time. It is not a cautionary tale about siege warfare or medieval politics. It is a study in how human systems relate to certainty. How comfort dulls curiosity. How success anesthetizes skepticism. Every empire believes its collapse will be dramatic, unmistakable, and external. In reality, collapse is subtle, procedural, and internal long before it is visible. It happens when people stop asking whether their defenses still match the threats they face. When they protect symbols instead of functions. When they assume someone else is watching the gate. The city did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it believed it was finished falling. Because it mistook endurance for invincibility. Because it trusted that what had always been enough would remain enough, even as the world changed its terms. That is how empires begin to die, not with a roar, but with the quiet confidence that nothing truly fundamental needs to change. And that confidence, more than any enemy, is what history always waits for.